Pope writes, number 5, seeing each other reciprocally through the very mystery of creation, as it were, the man and the woman see each other still more fully and clearly than through the sense of sight itself, that is, through the eyes of the body. They see and know each other, in fact, with all the peace of the interior gaze, which creates precisely the fullness of the intimacy of persons, unquote. The choice of words tells its own story. The grace of original innocence gives man a clear, or we could even say a divine perspective or way of looking at the human body. It is a kind of seeing, a knowing, a savouring, you could say, of the depth and richness of the truthfulness of the body. It is a contemplative gaze which penetrates the mystery of being and simply enjoys a body which reveals a person in all of his or her primordial beauty. This is what we mean when we talk about wisdom or sapientia, which is incidentally linked to the word sapor, that's Latin, meaning a taste or flavour or relish of something. One author has described it as a loving knowing, or we could add a knowing loving. In the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, wisdom, while principally in the intellect, corresponds to charity or love in the will. It is this completeness in their being, sense and spirit, intellect and will, which makes them capable of beholding the reciprocal beauty of the other, and of simply knowing what it is to be, quote, for someone, unquote, or, quote, beside someone, unquote, as if suddenly everything begins to make sense, and the world or plan of being enters into the fold of the human heart. So it should be for every pair of human lovers who contemplate the mystery of being, goodness, truth, and beauty, revealed in a human body as it is at the dawn of creation. It is the shared delight which brings man to himself and causes him to go out of himself towards the other. This is the secret of his existence, as it were, how he comes to self-realization, not so much in staying within, but in transcending self, in the gift of self. Gaudium et Spes tells us, man cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of self, unquote. At the beginning of creation, the woman gave herself to the man and he to her. It was the discovery of wisdom. To be, in its fullest sense, is to love, and to love is to make a gift of oneself. In the loss of oneself, one discovers oneself, and a way of being worthy of man, male and female. The grace of Christ. How does what we have been saying relate to the mystery of the Word made flesh? When Pope John Paul II speaks of the mystery of original innocence, he speaks of it in two ways, but with the same basic meaning. Firstly, it is a gracing, or in Italian, gratificazione. Secondly, it is an endowment with grace, his words, which is a way of translating the Italian verb gratificare. The emphasis here, as in the traditional language of grace, is on the divine action, the plan of God, into which we are incorporated as sons in the Son or as co-heirs with Christ. It is important to note that for a theologian like Henri de Lubac, grace fulfills human potentialities. It raises us to what we are meant to be in God's eyes. In his book, Le Surnaturel, he argues that we cannot be but ordered to a supernatural end. In the Church's understanding of the grace of original innocence, man was created in, I quote, a state of holiness and justice, unquote. He enjoyed the grace of divine intimacy and was already a partaker in the divine life. Of course, this begs the question as to how the coming of Christ is related to the grace of original innocence. At a later stage of his career, incidentally, Henri de Lubac is reputed to have regretted not having emphasized the Christological dimension of grace to a greater degree in his book Le Surnaturel. It may be that the Pope is responding to this in man and woman he created them. At any rate, he is aware of the need to contextualize grace, the grace of original innocence, within a clear Christological framework. The manner in which he does this is worth our attention. He writes, I quote, it's number 6. From the beginning, man, male and female, shared in this supernatural gift. This endowment was given in view of him who from eternity was beloved as Son, although, according to the dimension of time and history, it preceded the incarnation of this beloved Son. This supernatural endowment, the fruit of man's election in Christ before the ages, was brought about precisely out of regard for him, that one and only beloved, while chronologically anticipating his coming in the body. Unquote. In other words, the grace of original innocence belongs to a unified divine plan. Just an aside, in Chartres Cathedral in France, there's in the north portal of it, there's God the Father creating Adam, but his eyes are fixed on Christ as he creates the first man. It's a similar theme or idea cropping up in the Church's tradition. So it's a unified divine plan. It belongs to the great mystery of love, which unfolds in human history as it is accomplished in Christ in the fullness of time. As the Pope writes, number 7, at the center of the mystery is Christ. In him, precisely in him, humanity has been eternally blessed with every spiritual blessing, unquote. It is on the lips of Christ that the mystery of humanity is revealed, or at least rediscovered after the fall of Adam. This is perhaps one of the most moving episodes of the whole of the catechesis. The words of Christ capture the mystery of man, male and female, in his original splendor before the fall of our first parents. They reveal to him his dignity as a Son of God with a new consciousness of the meaning of his body, its spousal attribute, which echoes in his, quote, innermost being, unquote, as a, quote, a call, unquote, to become what he is meant to be in the eyes of his Creator. In this sense, the words of Christ derive their efficacy from their consciousness of human dignity. Christ knows what is in man, and hence their lofty eloquence, which woo the human heart, or simply appeal to it because they tell us who we are. We could call it wisdom. The Pope calls it an explicit anthropology, which shows the unity of the divine plan, creation and redemption, recapitulated in the mystery of Christ. And our mystery is persons created in the image and likeness of the Creator. In this sense, the words of Christ draw from within. They see with the eyes of the heart the most high calling of man and lead him to seek it. This is closely linked to the meaning of educere in Latin, which means to draw out to one's potential, which is close to the word educare, or by what we mean to educate in the best possible sense. The words of Christ are a call to man to realize his deepest possibilities or potentialities, to discover again the beauty of the mystery of a body which reveals a person. The call is an echo, his words, of that good beginning, his words, whereby man discovered the spousal meaning of the body, and at the same time the mystery of his existence as a son in the Son, even before the coming of Christ. The Pope writes, number 8, Christ's words in the Sermon on the Mount are not a call hurled into emptiness. These words bring to light another vision of man's possibilities. It is important that in his heart he does not feel himself irrevocably accused and given up to the concupiscence of the flesh, but in that same heart he feels himself called with energy, called as a person in the truth of his humanity, and thus also in the truth of his masculinity and femininity, in the truth of his body. Called in that truth which has been his inheritance of the beginning, which is deeper than the sinfulness inherited, unquote. It is perhaps one way of speaking of the word redemption, a sort of realization of the possibilities of our being, which have been clouded over, obscured by the concupiscence of the flesh. The words of Christ give us a new sense of the wonder of our being, something of its mystery, not without the body, but through the body. And at the same time, a new way of being and acting appropriate to our consciousness of our dignity as sons in the Son. The ethos of redemption. This new way of being and acting is realized as an ethos. It is simply another way of speaking about grace, and a way in which Pope John Paul II chooses to do so throughout the catechesis. It might surprise you, but in the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, grace is not primarily about doing things, even to the extent of knowing and loving God himself. It is a more intimate principle of being human, well, actually divine, than one's conscious acts. St. Augustine alludes to it in his Confessions in the words, Deus interior intimo meo, which translates roughly as, God more inward to me than I am to myself. For St. Thomas, grace is primarily a participation in the divine nature, a way of being, before it is about doing things or acting deliberately as a son in the Son. Pope John Paul II does seem to have a similar idea about grace as an ethos in man and woman he created them, since he constantly links the words being and acting, but tends to emphasize more the element of our consciousness of the dignity we have received in Christ. He writes, number 9, this fullness must be discovered first with the interior vision of the heart, and then with an appropriate way of being and acting. The form of the new man can come forth from this way of being and acting in the measure in which the ethos of the redemption of the body dominates the concupiscence of the flesh and the whole man of concupiscence, unquote. For John Paul II, it seems that grace realized as an ethos takes on an embodied form in the temperance of desires, an ability to overcome the concupiscence of the flesh and so live with the dignity of a son of God. In the classical tradition, this is known as the virtue of temperance, or when it deals exclusively with sexual matters, the virtue of chastity, sometimes called continence, although it differs somewhat. Pope John Paul II has an interest in this tradition, and indeed carves his own particular developments out of it. He writes, number 10, in the first place, purity, he calls it purity here, is an ability, or in the traditional language of anthropology and ethics, an attitude. And in this sense, it is a virtue. What we have here is a practical ability that enables man to act in a definite way, and at the same time not to act in a contrary way. Purity must obviously take root in the will, in the very foundation of man's conscience and acting, if it is to be such an ability or attitude. Thomas Aquinas sees the object of purity even more directly in the power of sense desire. This power must in particular be mastered, ordered, and enabled to act in a manner conforming to virtue if purity is to be attributed to the human being. Purity is a variant of the virtue of temperance, unquote. If anything, this rather long quotation shows the Pope's awareness of the long-standing tradition of virtue. He does not begin with a tabula rasa, a blank sheet, but with a clear sense of the complexity of this tradition and something of its sophistication, going by the different words he uses to describe a virtue in just one paragraph. Typical. He is not content, however, simply to restate this tradition when it comes to speaking of the virtue of temperance or chastity. He wants to shape it or accommodate it in such a way that it fits in or squares well with everything he has been saying about the dignity of the person, and how the grace of Christ enters the human heart with a wisdom and a new way of looking at the world, not least of all the human body, that alters the mystery of our being. It is in this sense that the practice of virtue, or in this case temperance or chastity, is inseparable to the discovery of self. It is a new way of living the body, and with it a new consciousness of human freedom, self-possession, and the body's spousal meaning. The Pope writes, number 11, the ethos of redemption is realized in self-mastery, that is, in the continence of desires. In this behavior, the heart remains bound to the value from which it would otherwise distance itself through its desire. The value in question is the body's spousal meaning. The value of a transparent sign by which the Creator, together with the perennial reciprocal attraction of man and woman through masculinity and femininity, has written in the heart of both the gift of communion, unquote. In the teaching of Pope John Paul II, the temperance of desires, self-mastery, is ordered to the gift of self. It is a person who is in self-possession of himself, who is capable of seeing or perceiving the beauty of the person revealed by the body's spousal meaning. To be chaste, then, not only means to choose a good life, it is to deepen it and saturate it with meaning. This is perhaps one of the striking features of the catechesis. Temperance of desires or self-mastery provides a new way of looking at a person. It is a kind of seeing, an existential contemplation of the goodness, beauty, and truthfulness of the body which reveals a person. It is the mirror of the self. To see beauty is somehow to